When a celebrity or politician is out in public, you might expect them to be accompanied by numerous bodyguards donning suits and earpieces as they keep crowds out of the way. But nowadays, the stereotypical security detail is far less common.
We adjusted our security posture to walk through without any problems. We were walking amongst the general public and nobody knew who we were because we were just jeans t-shirt.
John McDermott is a security professional who's been specializing in executive and close protection for 25 years.
The industry within the last, I'm going to say 4 years, is starting to see the value of being a thinking man's game.
He says even when you're guarding a highly important person, it's crucial to be courteous and respectful at all times.
That's your currency, that's your approach, and it also shows a level of professionalism. Coming in, throwing your weight around, it's not going to win you any favors.
We'll also explore the best ways to communicate with staff who are in the field and subtle deterrents that can lower risks when moving through a crowd. Hello there, I'm Tristan Field-Jones, and once again, welcome to SitRep. John McDermott joins us now, and John, we'll be covering several topics with you throughout the episode. But first, tell us about what you do and how you ended up in the world of security.
Oh, and well, I kind of retired from the British military, and when I came back home from the UK, I got into the private security industry in 1998. Ever since, I've been in the private security industry, and I started off in kind of with the close protection aspect of it, but I also was taught the broader spectrum of security and all the aspects involved in that. So yeah, I've been in the industry ever since, and I've done a variety of different tasks and worked in a variety of different fields. Yeah.
I think before we drill down on that, I'd like you to expand a little bit more on your experience in executive and close protection.
Sure.
What can you tell us about some of the situations you've been in or some of the people you've worked for and had to protect over the years?
Absolutely. No, my first gig was to actually look after the president and CEO of a casino. And whenever he came into town, that was my task, is to look after him, drive him around and keep him out of trouble. But also when he wasn't in town, I also helped with the VIPs in that casino. I would help be what we call now a site liaison for that particular VIP. And there would be other sports figures or political figures that would like to come into this casino. And because of my security background and knowledge, I was always put on task. So I even had to, even on again, drive home the big winners from the casino that would have a big cash payout. So yeah, I would have to do that. But that was back in the days when things were a little less regulated, I'll say.
It's the diplomatic way of putting it, I guess.
Yeah.
And we will for sure kind of talk a little bit more about how close protection and executive protection has changed over the years for sure. I think I want to establish some basics before we really get into this here. I think the cliched image of close protection is, bodyguards keeping hordes of fans away from a celebrity, or, agents surrounding a politician. Again, the quintessential image of that, the Secret Service in the U.S., right? I mean, I think when you think executive protection, that's probably the first image that comes to mind for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. But that's a bit of a narrow idea when it comes to the profession, because John, as you and I have discussed, there are a lot of components that make up executive protection. So let's look into that. Besides the bodyguards, what are the other aspects that involve this part of the industry?
Well, it's interesting you brought up this name bodyguard. That's been kind of floating around in the industry for since I could remember, 25 or plus years. Some people, it has evolved from kind of being a strong man in a suit to a thinking man's game. And it's always been the argument that close protection and executive protection or bodyguarding is a thinking man's game, because it is. Um, you have to, in the industry, there's two different styles. And one style, I would call it the British style, which is very low profile, kind of blend in the background, kind of um, not like taking away from your principle. And then the American style, which is you're stacking bodies and equipment in front of the principal, basically moving them from a castle to an armored vehicle to another fortress, and having all the tools in between. But there is a balance between the two, that, and there's a time for having that type of style. So um, what I was taught off of the British model, and it, I've always operated off that kind of concept: low profile, don't attract attention, because as soon as you get more than three males in a suit walking in the same direction, doesn't matter if it's important or not important, people think something's happening, and that draws attention. Um, but if you're trying to operate in a way that you're not trying to attract attention to the VIP or the person, then you have to adjust your approach. And so it's been an ongoing discussion, and it's an endless discussion on, are you a bodyguard or are you close protection? But thankfully, that the industry within the last, I'm going to say 4 years, 4 years, is starting to see the value of being a thinking man's game, and having the ability to anticipate and adapt your environment in order to avoid trouble and mitigate anything. There are some VIPs that want that attention because they want to remain relevant in the media cycle. But that's all part of the tactic. That's all part of the game they're trying to play. But if you're trying to um, be a close protection and have an actual security posture, then that is all part of the image of what's happening. Because sometimes the VIP is not the client, and the client is not the VIP. So that brings in two different paradigms. And so let's say the VIP is a movie star that is known to have drama, then they're going to do something to create the drama. And now in this day and age with social media, it creates a bit of a bigger challenge for the security team if people aren't on the same page. But yeah, it's an ever evolving industry, and thankfully now it's starting to kind of get a little more regulated. And down in the States, they've created a close protection standard that is now kind of mimicking the ASIS standard for the certified protection professional, which is a gold standard within the security industry. And now the close protection aspect is based off of that model, and they're growing that. So thankfully, there's some sort of effort, and very experienced individuals involved in this initiative.
Let's go back, John, for a second, and let's talk a little bit more about the bombastic approach, if you will, to close protection and the more subtle approach. I'm sure each strategy has advantages and disadvantages, but the, again, stereotypical image of the celebrity or the important person walking down a street in a limo with 100 bodyguards and a lot of stuff like that, where it makes a statement that, hey, I'm important.
Right.
Is that really very common? And is, especially nowadays, is that type of executive protection potentially more dangerous, ironically?
Uh, well, whenever you're walking for a long period of time, it doesn't matter if you're in a high profile posture or low profile posture. Whenever you're walking any distance, um, you're vulnerable. Um, so sometimes having big, strong, bald guys in black suits surrounding an individual does act as a deterrent. But that is the visible deterrent. That's the inner circle. That's the last line of defense, I'm going to call it. The outer line of defense is going to be walking in the crowd and walking beside the crowd, walking through the crowd. But that, given that, that could be, you could be just also, the budget could only afford one person. So how do you strike that balance with a one person close protection team? It's a challenge. It's always adjusting. It's always adapting, trying to make the environment and things work. Um, yeah. So if you're lucky enough to have an inner and outer circle of a team, even if it's one or two people in the outer circle and one or two people on the inner circle, then then you utilize your assets the best way you can. Um, Having it in the private industry, when you have very limited resources sometimes to do a job, it becomes it becomes a kind of a three pot two lid situation, and you have to learn how to make sure that the pots don't boil over, and just working with what with what you have. So yeah, the biggest thing is, especially in close protection, is the ability to adapt and anticipate trouble. That's the two primary keys that I function off of, is to adapt to the situation and anticipate trouble. And if we know where we might find trouble, for example, walking down the street and into a like a bottleneck area, we have to be able to adjust and adapt to that to mitigate any potential hazard in that area. If you're not in the right mindset or the right, like paying attention to where you're at and knowing what you're doing, then you're going to get caught out. And it happens to the best of us sometimes.
So, John, talk a little bit more about anticipating threats and what you do to plan for risks, because I'm sure there's a fair amount of planning that takes place before you're
Mm-hmm.
actually accompanying someone or taking care of a VIP or whoever that may be. But let's explore that a little further.
Sure. Yeah. It, Pre social media days and pre internet days, we would have to go on the ground and do advanced venue assessments, route planning, and work with um, like the broad strokes of a threat, and to be more of a reactive kind of posture. We would be we would know the environment that we're going to. We wouldn't have a random venue that we would just randomly appear at. We would, if we were lucky enough to have enough notice that of a schedule where we want to go and how we want to get there. And so we would send a couple of people on the ground and do a venue assessment and look at all the ins and outs and the back doors and all of the holes and all that stuff in whatever venue that we're going to go to. And we'd also do a route plan, which would highlight bottlenecks and highlight current traffic flow and or construction. But that would change. You know, we would only do that like maybe 12 hours prior to going to that venue or whatever. But now with social media and with like a little mini computer in your hand, with Google Maps and all that stuff, the venue and the route planning aspect has changed a little bit, but not a lot. If you know the old school ways, you can still circumvent the new school ways. And for example, if you use Google Maps, it can be spoofed, and it can look like there's a huge traffic jam in a certain area that will direct you to a different area, and you could be unknowingly driven into kind of like uh ambush zone. So knowing the route and knowing the old pen and paper way sure helps, but having the tools like social media and open source intelligence sure kind of helps with changing your uh changing your security posture before you even leave the before you even go on the ground. Nowadays, we have this real-time information that we can anticipate the problems and drive around it, or go through it, or avoid it, and go the opposite direction. And it's just what that does is that it provides a smooth transition to a um whole different way of operating for the VIP, because usually if you're working with a VIP that's, say, in business, time is money, and if you can facilitate that smooth transfer from A to B to C without much hiccups, then you're helping your client out a lot.
What happens and how do you handle a circumstance when somebody slipped past? I mean, politicians around the world have had literal pie in the face. I can think
Yeah,
of George W. Bush. I can think of
yeah,
Jean Chrétien, one of the Canadian Prime Minister.
yep,
In the UK, several politicians there have been milkshaked, right?
yep,
So
yep.
it's not going to be 100% foolproof. So
Nope.
how do you react when you see that threat? Maybe you see somebody approaching with something,
Yep,
or again, it might be kind of silly to think that somebody approaching with a pie might be a security threat because we don't really
yep,
see it that way. But maybe you spot that, or maybe they're coming into close range of this VIP or this celebrity, whatever it may be.
yep.
What do you need to do in those circumstances?
Well, that's a good question. It's a tricky question. Um, because sometimes, let's just say, like we've had many examples. They're doing like a pancake breakfast, for example. So there's going to be all sorts of people coming in close proximity to your principal or the politician. Everybody knows that that politician's going to be there, or the individual's going to be there. So it really comes down to awareness. A lot of these jobs requires a person to be switched on for more than 12 hours a day. And it becomes very mentally taxing, and it's really hard to be switched on to possible threats, even a pie in the face, because that's embarrassment to your client. Um, so, having that layered protection helps. But how do we react to that? Well, like, we're always thinking of like bad guys trying to assault or whatever. But even just the small things of slipping on a stair, or going the wrong down the wrong hall, or getting delayed from A to B, those things actually happen more often than the the ninja coming in and doing something. So I was thinking about one job that I ended up doing was, I my client was actually Meatloaf, and I could talk about it now because he's passed on, and it's well known on social media. So on YouTube, he was playing in Edmonton, um, at a venue here, and then he collapsed on stage. The reason why he collapsed was because he didn't hydrate himself enough to do his own songs. So when he collapsed, we got on stage, and we just had we just protected his image from that point forward, because people would want to now pull out their cameras and start to see, record it for live prosperity purposes. But we just blocked that with bodies first, and then screens. And then when the paramedics came, assessed him, and moved him out onto the back at the back of house through the ambulance, we just blocked further further images from people taking pictures from high angle area. And so, it just trying to protect as much of the image as you can of the individual from further embarrassment. And so, sometimes you can just laugh it off and wipe it down and keep moving. And sometimes it's a more serious incident where like a medical incident where you have to change and go from the pulling the security team that's around that was part of the venue security and the event security and change their posture to now protecting the individual so there's a smooth transition out.
I think the point overall you're trying to bring is it's a matter of just being aware and knowing your surroundings and
Yeah.
also not just operating in a bubble. So, not
Yeah.
just thinking of the bodyguard in the suit, but also thinking of what does this look like from an image perspective? What does this look like from a crisis perspective? And I think maybe
Right.
that's the point that you're trying to bring home, John, is that you can't
Yeah.
just look at it in isolation.
Right. Exactly. No, the silo effect is is detrimental on not only the macro scale but the micro scale. Um, so it's I think of it as kind of like an accordion, and you got to know when to stretch it out, know when to pull it in, and work with it. And y- y- as much as you might think it's bad to share information with other stakeholders or other people involved in a venue, it's actually to your benefit. And in the private side, you don't have the authority as law enforcement agencies can and do and say, oh, I want to park my vehicle here because I can. Um, just be just because you can doesn't mean you should. So always manners. Please, thank yous, may I's. Would it be okay if we did this? It goes a long way. That's your currency. That's your approach. And as they say, you get more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. So um, that it also shows a level of professionalism, right? Coming in, throwing your weight around, it's not going to win you any favors. Going in and say, hey, can I? It'd be very helpful if you could help me out with this. And as a security operator, for example, the security guard in a venue, they're like, oh, yes, I would very much like to be part of this action. I would very much like to help you out and facilitate your transition from A to B. Um, it's it's just a cooperation and it's a respect thing. So you got to remain humble and you got to remain kind and even in a hostile kind of like build up of a crowd, you talk to an individual and say, can we just sneak through or whatever. And yeah, oh yeah, sure, not a problem. Instead of like pushing people through, only in extreme circumstances do you need to do that. It's always words, words, words. And it's always worthwhile just taking that few extra seconds to talk to an individual and say, hey, this is kind of what I need to do. Can you help me out with that? And yeah, presto, not a problem.
We've been talking a lot about important people and kind of the visible security presence. But
Mm-hmm.
let's say you're accompanying the CEO of a major company, or perhaps someone who works in a high profile position at a government organization,
Mm-hmm.
and they need the protection, but you want to do as much as possible to blend in or to be
Mm-hmm.
discreet.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go about that, especially if the person you're protecting is potentially at high risk?
Great. Well, I had one client that was specifically what you said. Um, flew in a flew into the area with a private jet. He owns a big company, worldwide known. Um, but jeans and t-shirt, driving around in a minivan. Like who's gonna look at a loser cruiser, right? We're just gonna it facilitates transition in and out of the vehicle so much easier. It's a nice ride, and we were dressed casual, jeans and t-shirt. It was the environment that we went into, and it was in Calgary. And so people don't like we talked to the venue. We had the security layer in place and all the uniformed security people there, but we just blended in, and that wasn't a problem. And so that's deterring focus on that individual. We adjusted our security posture to walk through without any problems. We were walking amongst the general public and nobody knew who we were because we were just jeans, t-shirt, right? Just casual looking things. If we were all dressed up in suits, then that changes the posture. Um, I also had one client that that didn't even want security around her at all. So we had to look at her and be as they call it, a covert protection. I just call it defensive protection. So she would like to walk to work, and we just follow her in the car. We knew her path, we knew her routine, and if we had to go out on foot, we would go out on foot. But we were invisible to her, and because that's what she wanted. But she was the principal, but the client was somebody else, and so we had to keep an eye on them for that principal for as much as possible. So the approach changes, and more clients and principals are asking for the lower profile optic of security. It's only when they're going into known events that they want the known security there. And what they usually end up doing is having a site liaison security layer there. I had one client was running for re-election, and we were the outer circle, and the inner circle was part of her team. And but we would just blend in the crowd. We were in the crowd, looking like we were part of the people there to rally. We would stand on the outside of the venue. If it was a closed venue, we would stand on the outside in jeans, t-shirt, and we would just blend. People always anticipate layers of security that you can see, but sometimes that layer of security is not something you can see, and that is a defense mechanism in itself. So having that opportunity or option to blend, yeah, you might want to put the big guys right up front, a visible deterrent, but also you have the more skilled or the skilled individuals also blending within the crowd. So it all depends on what the posture, I call it the security posture, is all about.
When you have a security detail,
Right.
depending on the size of the team, which, yeah, as you mentioned, varies quite a bit,
Yeah.
what's the best way to communicate with them and to communicate with perhaps others who may be, working back at the office or working in a vehicle or
Right.
whatever that may be?
Right.
How do you make sure that communication is clear, concise, and
Right.
what equipment should you have to make sure that everybody's talking to each other in the appropriate manner?
Right. That's another good question. And at this day and age, with the variety of different tools that you can use, um, like you could use Zello that's on your cell phone, which is kind of acts as a CV type thing, but there's a delay in that. Um, or you can just use basic hand signals. Something I learned when I worked in the bars, a code system, 1, 2, or 3. And if I were to stand in a crowd and I went like this to somebody that was observing me, watching me, then they know the situation is going down. But it means nothing to anybody else. somebody standing with the three fingers up means nothing, but except for the people that are on the team. And sometimes the environment is so loud that you can't transmit on radio, you can't transmit on phone, and you can't take the time to text. So you have to have hand signals. You have to have knowing everybody's on the same page. Hand signals are knowing actions. The best radio mic for noisy venues is a throat mic, and you can hide it under your collar, and you can press the talk switch, and you can talk, and the noise is not gonna, the background noise is not gonna eliminate your voice message because it's picking up on your throat. But it all depends on your environment, and sometimes no overt comms, like you think of the coily tube going through your ear, and that sometimes people just put the coily tube down your throat, and there's no radio comms. It acts as a deterrent, and it makes it look like you have radio comms with other people, but it's just an image. These are all kind of tricks in the trade. But at the end of the day, again, just having a simple, effective way of doing something and not making it get too complex.
John, I like to end these podcast episodes with a bit of advice that we can provide the audience, because we've identified a lot of issues and we've talked a lot about the risks and threats out there when it comes to executive protection. But what would be your advice when you look back at 25 years of experience in the field? What would you suggest that security professionals out there nowadays plan for, look out for? Just a point to bring home from this discussion when it comes to close protection.
Wow. Good question. The best bit of advice that I've been given from a retired chief of police officer is don't be action imperative. Don't jump as quickly as you think you might have to. Always take the time to find out what's happening, what's going on. And if it's important information, talk face to face.
John, your insight has been incredibly valuable. If people want to find out more about you, or if there's maybe any resources online that you think would be worth reading, where can they go?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn and send me a message there and go from there.
John, again, really appreciate you being a guest, and again, you've provided some excellent insight here. John McDermott is a veteran of the security industry specializing in executive and close protection, joining us on SitRep. I'm Tristan Field-Jones. Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email me at sitrep@samdesk.io or follow us on Twitter @samdeskofficial. Until next time, stay safe out there.